Welcome to the Tim Booker channel, where wisdom is worth spreading. Wishing you a delightful audiobook experience. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a book titled Steve Jobs. This is the only authorized biography of Steve Jobs during his lifetime, written by the renowned biographer Walter Isaacson. Isaacson has previously authored biographies of notable figures such as Franklin, Einstein, and Da Vinci, all of whom share a common trait: they were geniuses who changed the world. Steve Jobs, often considered one of the most influential and remarkable entrepreneurs, was determined to leave his mark on history. He wanted to be remembered alongside these great minds and sought to establish his historical legacy. In 1997, Jobs returned to Apple and launched the Think Different ad campaign featuring iconic figures like Einstein, Bob Dylan, and Gandhi, emphasizing the power of thinking differently to change the world. Jobs wanted to be part of this lineage of visionaries and aimed to transition from a great entrepreneur to a historical giant. In 2004, Jobs first approached Isaacson to write his biography, but Isaacson declined as he was working on Einstein's biography at the time. It wasn't until 5 years later, with Jobs battling cancer and revolutionizing technology through products like the iPhone, that Isaacson decided to write the biography. Jobs' life, like many mythological stories, followed the hero's journey structure. From co-founding Apple in a garage to being ousted, starting NeXT, acquiring Pixar, and ultimately returning to Apple to transform it into a global tech giant, Jobs' journey was extraordinary. Despite not being an inventor himself, Jobs had a unique talent for envisioning, refining, and reshaping the technology in consumer electronics industries. He crafted a lifestyle centered around digital products and made Apple the core provider of this way of life. He meticulously drove the creation of products that would fit into people's pockets, bags, and daily lives. Isaacson had unprecedented access to Jobs, conducting over 40 interviews with him and unrestricted interviews with over 100 family members, friends, competitors, colleagues, and more. The book was published just 19 days after Jobs' passing in 2011 and became one of the most significant events of that year. Jobs' story raises questions about the source of his creativity, imagination, and relentless drive for innovation. It delves into his beliefs, values, and the often described selfish, temperamental, and ruthless aspects of his personal life and management style. To what extent was Apple a reflection of his personality, and to what extent did it result from compromises with the environment? These questions find their answers in this book. A good biography often narrates seemingly ordinary experiences, childhood grievances, ambitious youth, setbacks, and failures, as well as the unwillingness to compromise and an unyielding determination. Jobs once said, "The broader one's understanding of the human experience, the better design we will have." Now, let's explore Steve Jobs' life story. In the following sections, I'll break down the book into 3 parts. First, I'll introduce Jobs' life before founding Apple, exploring the influences that shaped his personality and worldview. Second, I'll analyze Jobs' personality traits and their impact on Apple's products, including his perfectionism, selfishness, and strong desire for control. Third, we'll examine Jobs' transformation and maturation during the 11 years he spent away from Apple, exploring his glorious failures and the lessons he learned from them. Alright, let's dive into the first part, Steve Jobs' life before founding Apple. During Jobs' formative years, certain factors had a profound influence on his personality and worldview. 2 significant events in Jobs' upbringing left a lasting impact on him. Firstly, he was born out of wedlock in 1955, and his biological parents had to give him up for adoption. He was adopted by the Jobs family, comprising a high school dropout mechanic and a stenographer. Despite their modest educational backgrounds, they were loving and dedicated parents who provided Jobs with the best care and education possible. Jobs was aware of his adoption from an early age. One day, at the age of 6 or 7, he confided in a girl across the street, telling her about it. She asked him if this meant his biological parents didn't want him, which shook him deeply. However, his adoptive parents reassured him that they chose him, and it wasn't a matter of rejection. Whether this left some form of childhood trauma on Jobs is unclear and not explicitly acknowledged by the author. Jobs insisted he never felt abandoned. Instead, his adoptive parents always made him feel special. This sense of being both abandoned and chosen likely contributed to 2 fundamental contradictions in his personality. On one hand, he had a strong desire for control, wanting to dominate his environment and everything he created. On the other hand, He felt unique and exempt from the rules that applied to others, which likely deepened his natural rebelliousness and stubbornness. He loved his adoptive parents but was skilled at emotionally manipulating them to bend to his will. Jobs insisted on attending the expensive private Reed College, with no apparent expressions of gratitude, and even refused to say goodbye when he later dropped out after just one semester. His interactions with his parents in this phase established a template for how he would deal with people in his life, including friends, family, and colleagues. He would make extreme and unreasonable demands while those around him often succumbed to his will. Another critical aspect of Jobs' early life was the time and place he was born and raised. In 1960, at the age of 5, Jobs moved with his adoptive parents to Mountain View in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he spent his childhood. The San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s was at the nexus of political and technological trends on the American West Coast. On one hand, San Francisco was the birthplace of the 1960s counterculture movement, giving rise to various subcultures like rock and roll, the hippie movement, ecological awareness, and anti-war activism, which had a nationwide impact. On the other hand, Mountain View, as the heart of California's Santa Clara Valley, was the birthplace of Silicon Valley's engineer culture. During Jobs' childhood, this valley transitioned from a traditional agricultural community into a hub of microelectronics. This unique environment played a significant role in shaping Jobs. He absorbed engineering culture from a young age, nurturing his interest in mathematics, science, and electronics. He mingled with various geek clubs and groups. Simultaneously, he had a countercultural side, loving rock music, experimenting with psychedelics, idolizing figures like Bob Dylan and the Beatles, and even making a spiritual journey to India during a college hiatus. This trip to India had a profound and lasting impact on him, broadening his horizons beyond rational thinking and towards intuitive, experiential wisdom. Isaacson contends that Jobs possessed an innate ability to bridge the gap between the technology geeks and the artistic hippies, two groups often at odds. He believed that at the intersection of science and art lay the wellspring of creativity. Jobs repeatedly used an image at Apple's presentations, a crossroads sign with one road labeled liberal arts and the other technology. He stood at this crossroads and wanted Apple to stand there too. In Apple's products, technology merged seamlessly with exquisite design, aesthetics, tactile feel, user-friendliness, and even romance. However, Jobs' position at this intersection made him somewhat of an outsider, labeled eccentric or even mad by mainstream standards. Fortunately, Silicon Valley had a particular tolerance and protection for such individuals. For instance, at the age of 13, Jobs joined the Hewlett-Packard Explorer Club and called HP's CEO, Bill Hewlett, directly to request some parts. Not only did Hewlett take the call, but he also chatted with Jobs for 20 minutes, provided the parts, and offered him a summer internship. Jobs' confidence in himself, in Silicon Valley, and in technology was nurtured in this forgiving atmosphere. In summary, in the first part, we explored two significant events in Steve Jobs' upbringing that had a profound impact on his life. Firstly, being abandoned by his biological parents but chosen by his adoptive ones instilled in him a desire for control and a sense of uniqueness. Secondly, growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area during the 1960s exposed him to both countercultural and engineering influences, shaping his eclectic interests and his ability to bridge the worlds of technology and the arts. Now, let's move on to the second part. Steve Jobs' personality traits and their relationship with Apple products. Steve Jobs was undoubtedly a complex individual. On one hand, he possessed an intense passion for beauty, design, and technology. On the other hand, his personality had selfish, temperamental, highly controlling, and even ruthless aspects. The question is, are these two facets inherently connected? Many argue that Apple is a reflection of Jobs' personality. Does this claim hold merit? The author's overarching perspective on these questions is that Jobs' essence of success lies in his ability to seamlessly blend various contradictory traits and behaviors into one harmonious whole. Apple, to some extent, indeed reflects Jobs' personality. His less desirable traits are at least in part tied to his passion for aesthetics, design, products, and the ambition to build a lasting company. First and foremost, Jobs' inclination towards perfectionism and his meticulous attention to detail can be traced back to his adoptive father, Paul Jobs. As a mechanic, Paul instilled in him the belief that pursuing perfection means giving your all, even in places others might never see. For instance, when they painted a fence together, Paul advised him that even the backside should be painted perfectly because, as a true artist, you never compromise, and you never cut corners. This commitment to perfection persisted throughout Jobs' career, from co-founding Apple in his adoptive father's garage with Steve Wozniak to the creation of the first Apple computer, the iPod, iPhone, iPad, and even the design of Apple retail stores. Everything he created, whether in design, functionality, software, or hardware, had to be perfected to the utmost degree. Even if this perfectionism meant sacrificing cost-effectiveness and placing immense pressure on his employees, often straining their relationships, he unwaveringly stuck to his principles. For instance, during the development of the second Apple computer, he rejected the initial circuit board design because he felt the traces weren't straight enough. When working on the Macintosh, he obsessively focused on font design, debating the most aesthetically pleasing typefaces and spacing arrangements, all while those around him believed he was investing an excessive amount of time and energy on fonts. During the development of the iMac, he visited a jelly bean factory to learn how to infuse more vibrant colors into the perfect plastic casing. When it came to designing the interiors of Apple retail stores, he insisted on importing a particular shade of blue-gray stone for the flooring, rejecting a concrete replica with identical color and patterns that would have been 10% of the cost. A particularly moving detail regarding Jobs' perfectionism was a moment during his battle with cancer when he was in the intensive care unit. He had been comatose for several days and had just regained consciousness. The doctors wanted to place an oxygen mask on him, but he found the mask unattractive and refused to wear it. He asked the doctors to bring him 5 different masks to choose from. He also expressed his disdain for the oxygen monitor on his finger, deeming it too complicated, and offered several suggestions on how it could be simplified. Even in the face of a life-threatening condition, his unwavering desire for control and commitment to design persisted. Jobs' perfectionism manifested not only in his meticulousness but also in his intolerance of others tampering with his designs. He initially intended to allow only 2 expansion slots in the second Apple computer, one for a printer and one for a modem, but Steve Wozniak opposed this idea and added 8 expansion slots. However, starting with the Macintosh, Jobs couldn't tolerate anyone inserting circuit boards into expansion slots, disrupting his elegant designs. His products had to be holistic, enclosed environments. This design philosophy persists in Apple computers to this day. While companies like Microsoft in the 1980s and Google today adopt a more open approach, allowing their operating systems and software to run on various hardware from different manufacturers, Jobs vehemently believed that this approach would lead to subpar products. He aimed for end-to-end control over the entire user experience. Isaacson suggests that this obsessive sense of responsibility and the perfectionism behind it are partly rooted in Jobs' strong desire for control and his pursuit of perfection. At the thought of Apple's software running on mediocre hardware from other companies, Jobs would lose sleep. In his mind, Apple's products should provide a seamless and controlled experience. Furthermore, Jobs' control and perfectionism sometimes led to a phenomenon known as reality distortion field, where he possessed a powerful aura capable of distorting reality, making both himself and others believe in the achievement of seemingly impossible tasks. Isaacson delves into the origin of this reality distortion field, attributing it to Jobs' unwavering inner conviction. To be continued, in this world, there are some individuals who are truly exceptional, such as Steve Jobs himself, Einstein, Gandhi, and others. They are chosen by fate and inspired, which means that the rules of the real world don't always apply to them. They can either disregard these rules or create entirely new ones. So, when reality clashed with Jobs' desires, he often chose to ignore reality. Many years ago, when his daughter Lisa was born, he refused to be a father, denying that Lisa was his daughter and evading parental responsibilities. Years later, when he was first diagnosed with cancer, he again refused to face reality, avoiding conventional medical treatment and instead trying numerous unreliable alternative therapies, which ultimately led to a deteriorating condition that was hard to reverse. Even in minor acts of rebellion, like driving without license plates or parking in handicapped spots, he seemed to act as if he were completely exempt from the constraints of rules and reality. You might think that the term reality distortion field is just a euphemism for Jobs' brashness and deception. In fact, many of today's technological achievements were once just a blueprint, an idea, or a story in the early stages. They were nothing more than possibilities presented through reasoning or a certain narrative. However, they transitioned from mere stories to reality through creative inspiration. Many who had the opportunity to work with Jobs admit that his reality distortion field, while often causing them significant discomfort, could indeed lead them to excel beyond their usual capabilities. For instance, there was an occasion when Jobs stormed into the office of Larry Kenyon, a designer of the Macintosh operating system, complaining about the computer's slow startup time. Kenyon began to explain why reducing the startup time was challenging. Jobs interrupted him and asked, "Can you shave 10 seconds off the startup time? If it could save lives, would you find a way to do it?" With that, he went to the whiteboard and showed that if 5 million Mac users saved 10 seconds each day on startup, it would amount to approximately 3 million hours saved per year, equivalent to saving 100 lives. Kenyon was persuaded, and a few weeks later, he managed to reduce the startup time by 28 seconds. When the final design for the Macintosh was completed, Jobs gathered the entire team for a formal signing ceremony. Each team member's signature was solemnly etched onto the Macintosh computer's circuit board. As mentioned earlier, Macintosh had a closed design, and users couldn't open it. Except for those repairing the computers, no one would see these names. However, this motivated the employees significantly. This was how Jobs inspired people. The greatest motivation in the world is when a group of talented individuals comes together to create something great. When motivation is strong enough, and achieving it requires tremendous courage and responsibility, they stop merely envisioning a future, they are creating a reality. Of course, in most cases, the world operates beyond an individual's will. After Jobs' passing, Isaacson mentioned a detail in his book, saying, "As I neared the end of the book, Jobs started saying that he knew there were parts he didn't like, but he told me not to worry, he'd read it in a year." Isaacson felt a tremendous relief, believing that if Jobs said he'd be around in a year, then he surely would be. No one realized the logical inconsistency here. Similarly, Jobs' reality distortion field couldn't reverse the market trends for the Macintosh at the time. Despite being conceptually advanced with its superior graphical user interface and mouse-based operation, it suffered from insufficient memory, lacked an internal hard drive, and ran slowly. Furthermore, Jobs disliked fans, thinking they added noise to computers, so the Macintosh lacked a fan, resulting in poor heat dissipation and many component failures. Although the Macintosh initially gained popularity upon release, users eventually discovered its flaws, leading to its gradual decline in the market, losing out to Microsoft's Windows operating system. Despite Windows' technical inferiority to the Mac, Microsoft's open approach, focus on the market, and alliances with Intel and various PC manufacturers proved more successful. The Macintosh's performance in the market exacerbated conflicts between Jobs and Apple's board of directors, ultimately leading to his ousting from the company he co-founded. In summary, the second part of our discussion focused on Jobs' fervent passion for beauty and design, his perfectionist tendencies, and his strong desire for control, all of which contributed to his reality distortion field. This reality distortion field sometimes led to great achievements but at other times resulted in irrational decisions and even disastrous consequences, including his expulsion from Apple. Now, let's move on to the third part, which is about Steve Jobs' transformation or maturation journey. Steve Jobs rose to fame at a young age and stood at the forefront of his era as a revolutionary figure in his early 20s. After leaving Apple, there were 11 years of silence in his life. Whether it was his own creation, NeXT, or the later acquisition of Pixar from George Lucas, he didn't achieve much during this time. It wasn't until he turned 40 in 1995 that things started to change. First, Pixar's first 3D animated feature film, Toy Story, was released and became a massive box office success. The following year, Apple acquired NeXT, marking Steve Jobs' return to Apple and a new peak in his life. However, these 11 years of silence were crucial for Steve Jobs. As Isaacson put it, his later tremendous success wasn't because of his ousting from Apple but rather the glorious failures during his time away. So, what were these glorious failures, and what did Steve Jobs learn from them? Let's begin with his experience at NeXT. After leaving Apple, Steve Jobs founded NeXT. In this new company, he could finally unleash his true nature. He indulged his passion for design by spending $1 million to have a renowned designer create a logo for the company. He allowed his perfectionism to manifest in various ways, insisting that the computer's exterior had to be a sleek and beautiful cube, and even the screws inside had to be plated with expensive coatings. He demanded that engineers create custom chips for NeXT's computer, integrating multiple functions on one chip and constantly changing the desired features, causing repeated delays in development. He also compelled the design team to continually modify the factory's color schemes, resulting in machines and equipment being painted over and over again. At NeXT, we witnessed the replication of all of Steve Jobs' past experiences, including his intense passion for design and aesthetics, his reality distortion field, exceptional persuasive abilities, flawless product launches, and once again, failure. His initial goal was to create a powerful and reasonably priced computer for the high-end education market, but what he ended up with was a beautifully designed cube that was incredibly powerful, but also very expensive and impractical. Eventually, he had to abandon hardware and transform the company into a purely software-oriented one. This decision contradicted his fundamental belief in integrated hardware and software, and it was a source of great pain for him. These failures forced him to reflect on his own shortcomings, such as whether he was too obsessive about details or if his desire for control overshadowed his judgment of the market. More importantly, he questioned whether he was always right. While these questions don't necessarily have clear answers, for Steve Jobs, the willingness to introspect was already a significant transformation. Now, let's talk about Pixar. Steve Jobs acquired Pixar Animation Studios from the renowned director George Lucas. At the time, Pixar's main business was selling a software called RenderMan and researching high-end imaging computers for animation, aligning with Jobs' philosophy of integrated hardware and software. However, Pixar's computer research business failed, and other ventures didn't show potential for sustained growth. For 10 long years, Pixar struggled financially, and Jobs had to write personal checks to keep it afloat until the release of the 3D animated feature film, Toy Story. During his time at Pixar, Jobs learned to temper his need for control to some extent, giving creative minds the freedom to flourish. The management style of Pixar's spiritual leader, Ed Catmull, had a positive impact on him. Steve Jobs also learned that his ideas weren't always right, as he originally wanted Pixar to focus on developing graphic software rather than making animated films. If it weren't for the independent thinking of Pixar's talented individuals, they might have succumbed to his will. In this period, Steve Jobs' personal life underwent significant changes. His marriage to Laureen Powell brought emotional stability. Reconnecting with his biological mother and sister partially repaired his relationship with his abandoned daughter, Lisa. During this time, Jobs became more patient, better at curbing his control tendencies, and more adept at collaboration. These changes were crucial for Apple's future success. For instance, consider the App Store. Initially, Jobs resisted opening it to external developers. He didn't want outsiders developing applications for the iPhone because it might expose it to viruses or compromise its integrity. However, he quickly realized his mistake and devised a win-win solution. He allowed external developers to write applications, including competitors like Kindle. However, developers had to adhere to strict standards, undergo Apple's testing and approval, and could only sell their apps through the iTunes Store. This approach maintained openness while ensuring enough control to protect the iPhone's integrity and keep the user experience streamlined. Apple's success in the subsequent decade was not solely because Steve Jobs created great devices like the iPod, iPhone, and iPad. It was about creating a new ecosystem around these devices. In conclusion, Apple's successes in the last decade, aside from Steve Jobs' precise grasp of public aesthetics and the spirit of the times, also resulted from the patience, collaboration, and concessions he learned to some extent during his exile. So, to summarize, this third part discussed Steve Jobs' experiences of founding NeXT and acquiring Pixar during his 11-year hiatus after being ousted from Apple. These were the low points in his life, but these failures reshaped him and ultimately contributed to his greater success upon returning to Apple. Finally, let's summarize the content of this book. First, we talked about Steve Jobs' adopted identity, his upbringing in the San Francisco Bay Area of his generation, and how it initially positioned him at the intersection of technology and art. Then, we delved into his founding of Apple, particularly his experiences during the development of the Macintosh, examining the complex and extreme facets of his personality in relation to the products he created. While he had some dark aspects to his personality, these were not isolated, they were closely linked to his passion for beauty, design, products, and the creation of a lasting company. His impatience was part of his perfectionism, and his demanding nature was the flip side of his inspirational abilities. His reality distortion field compelled people to achieve seemingly impossible tasks. In conclusion, we discuss Steve Jobs' glorious failures during the 11 years of his exile and how these experiences transformed him into a truly mature business leader. These failures forced him to reflect on his own shortcomings and questioned his infallibility. While the answers to these questions were not always clear, the willingness to introspect marked a significant transformation in Steve Jobs. Thank you for listening to this book. We appreciate your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel. Like and share with your family and friends. Wisdom is worth spreading, paving the way for a brighter future. Thank you, and goodbye.